My name is Janet Hoek. I'm a co-director of the Aspire 2025 Research Centre at the University of Otago. As many of you will know, the New Zealand government recently released a discussion document setting out various measures that could be included in an action plan to help realise the Smokefree 2025 goal. To help inform discussion around some of those measures, we're talking to various international experts, and it's my pleasure this morning to welcome Professor Tom Novotny from San Diego State University, who's an expert in tobacco product waste, so discarded filters, or what's sometimes referred to as butt litter. So Tom, welcome. It's great to have you here, and thank you so much for offering to share your expertise with us. Maybe I could start just by asking you why it is that cigarettes have filters and what the filters actually do.
Well, filters appeared in the 50s, perhaps even earlier, but they were in response to the tobacco and health scare that was building rapidly at that time, even before the Surgeon General's reports and the Royal College of Physicians reports outlining the risks of smoking. And so the industry, even sometimes with the help of governments, our government, for instance, started trying to make cigarettes less harmful, or at least they thought that that would be possible to do. And so filters were clearly, like when you filter something, when you filter water, you end up with something that's healthier or at least safer. And so in the case of a filter on a cigarette, it was an attachment that was put on there that even when the smoker smoked it and looked at it, you could see dark staining that indicated to him or her that the filter was doing something good for them to protect them from the harms of smoking that were rapidly being noted. And, and there were a lot of different things that were tried, charcoal filters, all sorts of stuff, and ended up with the cellulose acetate filter, which is the most common one now on all commercially made cigarettes. It's a plant-based polymer plastic, and it has, been so widely used now. It's on 97% of cigarettes globally sold, 99% here in this country. And so it's been used originally to try to make cigarettes safer, and then it became much more of a marketing tool that said, okay, well, you can smoke and not quit, and this filter is going to protect you, or also it makes it easier to smoke. And the filters evolved to develop things like ventilation holes to make it easier to draw. But nevertheless, there was never really any clinical trial that said these things make cigarettes safer. And in fact, they would reduce the machine smoked tar and nicotine levels so that cigarettes could be advertised with low tar, low nicotine, with an implication that they're safer. But there was never really any sort of study on that. It was more machine smoking. And even with that, smokers were able to bypass the sort of, decreased smoking by compensatory smoking. So the decreased exposure with compensatory smoking. So they really were never really going to be a health device, a protective device. They were always going to end up being a marketing tool. And that's certainly what we've seen. And in fact, I think we can label them as a fraudulent marketing tool because the implication of the safety and the sort of reduced exposure has been really part of the whole practice throughout their history and continues to this day.
And so how is it then that these filters have come to be such a major environmental problem?
Well, to begin with, there's a lot of them. There's 6 trillion cigarettes sold globally, and we just talked about 2+ billion in New Zealand alone. And that's every year on a yearly basis. And almost all of these commercially made cigarettes, and that's the data that we have, is, there's roll your own and other kinds of tobacco products as well. We know that they all have this filter, almost all of them have this filter, and the filter is plastic. And even though the tobacco products, the tobacco leaf itself and the paper that's on a cigarette might biodegrade, filters don't. They biodegrade very poorly, if at all. They may photodegrade under ideal circumstances of light and moisture, but they are pieces of plastic and qualify as microplastics. And in fact, as they break apart, even if they do break apart over time, maybe 10 years, for instance, these microplastic particles still retain their composition and become part of the aquatic environment or land-based environment. And what we know is that they're not just unsightly litter, everybody knows that, but they're also toxic. And one could even consider them as toxic hazardous waste product because they're like a little tea bag that can leach out the chemicals that are found in the tobacco, especially after it's combusted. And these end up in the environment and can be measured in the environment.
So quite a few people have said, well, they end up in the environment because people who smoke discard them. And really, we just wouldn't have a problem if these people were more thoughtful about how they disposed of their tobacco butts once they'd finished a cigarette. What do you make of that argument?
Well, first of all, they're victims, just like, they are relative to the health consequences of smoking. They're ending up with the responsibility for a post-consumption waste product that the industry should have responsibility for. There's something called extended producer responsibility or product stewardship. That is an accepted environmental principle that when you produce a product that ends up being a piece of trash, the responsibility should start with the manufacturer, not just with the consumer. And in fact, what we see is that aside from smokers being sort of responsible, it's built into the smoking ritual. What do you do with it? Some of them think that they're actually doing a service by stomping on the butt so that it doesn't cause fires. And that's probably true. But at the same time, nobody's going to go bend down and pick it up and stick it into their pocket to carry it away. So there's very little, alternatives for them. Some people have tried handheld pocket ashtrays to bring along. But what are you going to do with those? Stick them in your pocket or your purse? Toss them into the sewer? Toss them into the rubbish bin? And what we really don't pick up on is that all of the cleanup activities, that is by communities and by voluntary groups, like surf riders here in this country and other groups in New Zealand, is really the responsibility for the waste is deferred from the tobacco industry and laid on the shoulders of not just smokers, but voluntary groups, communities, jurisdictions, and they take no responsibility for it. So we need to think about trying to move that responsibility back upstream to the industry.
Well, as you know, New Zealand's got, as one of the measures outlined in the action plan discussion document, a proposal that filters could be banned from cigarettes. I just wonder, what advice would you give to a country like New Zealand about implementing this measure? Are there particular things that we should be thinking about or doing or anticipating? What would you tell us?
Well, that is exactly one way of having more industry responsibility. It becomes something that we're responsible for changing the product. That's one way of doing it. And it is important to think about the filter as something that can be prevented. I mean, the trash from the filter that can be prevented. So thinking in terms of a public health upstream approach, I think it's important to not just rely on cleanups. Cleanups are important because they point out the problem. I mean, just collecting all of that trash, smelly, horrible stuff, makes people aware of the problem. But that doesn't solve the problem. And in fact, it's very little of the problem is picked up, in fact. So I think it's important to recognize that the product can be changed, that it has no ill health effects in order to ban this filter. We have just completed a clinical trial of unfiltered cigarettes here at San Diego State University. And what we found so far is that you would take the filter away from smokers and they find it less palatable, less satisfying, less easy to smoke. And in all of those things, we can assume already, but we think that what will happen is that smokers will smoke less. Maybe youth will be less inclined to smoke because the harshness of smoking is unmasked by removing the filter. And so I think looking at this as both an environmental enterprise, bringing the environmental advocacy and a tobacco control objective, bring the idea that why do we want to make cigarettes easier to smoke into the discussion is important. And I think it's also important to build into this whole process an ideas about what will come about. First of all, one will know that the tobacco industry is going to fight this tooth and nail because it is their serious marketing tool that they've had forever. So they will fight it, and they will do a lot of things like bring front groups together, small businesses, and say, oh, the world is going to crash because we reduce smoking so much that all of these businesses are going to go out of business, and the tax base is going to be destroyed. So one has to anticipate all of those things and come up with locally based arguments that can say this is not going to happen. So at a local level, I think working with small businesses to say, look, people are not smoking as much. We're going to do everything we can. It's a public health enterprise that involves the entire community, and we want to know what we can do to help make this work for you as well. As a team effort, basically nationally. I think that New Zealand, given the low level of smoking at 15% and the commitment to environmental justice and environmental protection, can make this work, probably more so than any other country. And what that does is that allows other countries to fall in behind them. So I would really like to encourage you to carry through on this one. I think it makes a lot of sense. We've tried a couple of times here in California and also in New York State, but so far it hasn't been able to overcome the adverse influence of the industry.
Well, look, thanks so much for that encouragement, Tom. It's really great to have that. And thanks especially for sharing your expertise with us. All of the videos that we've been conducting with people who offer expertise in tobacco control measures that have been outlined in the action plan are available on the Aspire 2025 website. You'll also find a lot of information set out in blogs which discuss in more detail some of the action plan measures. Thanks so much again, Tom, for sharing your expertise. It's been great to talk with you.